have Donna Murch, who's a Bunche Center visiting scholar, and she's an associate professor of history at Rutgers. I bet you're glad to be out of the cold. I'm very happy. And she's co-director of the Rutgers Center for Historical Analysis and the Black Atlantic. And we're very much welcome you today, and we're looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you. So I wanted to start just by thanking the Bunche Center. Director Darnell Hunt, Assistant Director Anna Christina Lemon, and the staff, Janet Freeman, Yolanda Jones, Dawn, and Lorena Hunter. It's just been wonderful being there, and this really represents brand new research that I've done in my book on crack and the war on drugs in Los Angeles. And I think the Bunche Center has been an ideal place to really begin this research. I wanted to start just by kind of bridging how I ended up writing about the war on drugs as a Black Panther scholar. I think of myself as a social movement historian, and I spent about 10 years really reconstructing the history of the Black Panther Party. And it's a bit of a journey in how I ended up writing about crack and the war on drugs. But in a way, writing about this period after the Panthers grew very organically out of my research on the Panthers. And one of the things that I did in researching Living for the City is that I conducted large numbers of interviews. And one of the kind of unspoken elements of this interview is that many of these former activists became addicts in the 80s and 90s. We didn't talk about it explicitly, but it was something that I was aware of. I even kind of came up with an informal description of this as dead periods, that in many ways I was talking to people about reconstructing the activism of their youth. And I felt this sense of almost barrier between what happened after the movement and then going back to these early years of youth activism. And at the time, this is something that I kind of kept in the back of my mind about how to understand it. Because in many ways, I'm a graduate student living in Oakland, starting in 1994. The person I'll be talking about, Webb, the journalist, is working at the San Jose Mercury News. He spent a lot of time in Oakland. And without really fully knowing it, crack and the war on drugs is all around me. And it deeply was influencing the participants themselves in the movement, and also kind of the environment in which people are trying to understand the Panther Party. So in that sense, I think it was really there from the origins. But when I finished my book, I was left with a whole series of new questions. So Living for the City is really an attempt to explain why you see the scale of youth movement and youth globalization in this relatively small city that has a very recent Black population. And I don't really have time to talk about this in detail, but I came up with kind of a series of things that I thought were important to the formation of this movement. But in writing this kind of social history, I was left with a new set of questions, which is essentially, what happened to the activists after the Black Power movement, Black radical movement, during a period of real right-wing resurgence, retrenchment, cutting of social welfare, so thinking about the long history of the activists. And thinking about how that linked also into the fates of Black communities after the civil rights and Black power movements. So the 1980s in many ways were an assault on the accomplishments of the post-war social movements, and the war on drugs and crack were the center of this. So first, in talking about the war on drugs, the war on drugs criminalized the kinds of young people that participated in the Black power movement. So exactly the age, urban youth, the kinds of people that really were the core basis of the party are the kinds of people that were targeted in the war on drugs. So this is a clear form of direct repression striking at the base of the party. But the Panthers, and this is not only the leadership, the rank and file, have always been very sophisticated in their political analysis. And one of the things that they constantly stressed was not only the war on drugs, mass incarceration, and direct state repression, but the effects of drug economies themselves. And I think that this is a history that really needs to be written not only around crack, but also around heroin in the 1970s. And it's a very common thing in different cities for people to talk about the aftermath of urban rebellions and movements, of really the problems of drug economies themselves and how they struck at core parts of the community and really became an incredibly divisive force. So this led me to think about different ways to understand state damage to movements. You have direct forms of repression and incarceration, but then you also have ways that the state creates conditions for drug economies to thrive. And I'm going to be talking about one very specific example, which is crack and the Contra War and Nicaragua and Honduras. But there are other examples of these links between the transnational politics of drug trafficking war and covert action. So that would be the second piece. It's just these different ways of understanding how the state damaged radical activism and these radical social movements. The final point I want to stress is the importance of social history. In approaching the war on drugs, in many ways, it's more straightforward to write the political history of the war on drugs, the history of the institutions, of the executive, legislative, federal, state, and local institutions that are involved in the war on drugs. But I think also reclaiming the history of how these institutions affected people on the ground is very important. So the social history, the experience of the war on drugs, and also of these drug economies. So this is, I think, in many ways a harder thing to research, and it requires using tools of historical recovery that many of us have used in writing about radical social movements. So a point I wanted to make about that is that crack would devastate individuals and families precisely because too often it was experienced as intensely personal and in isolation. And yet looked at from hindsight, the crisis was an expansive phenomenon that linked hundreds of thousands of people, community institutions, and state actors. In some, it was a topic more than worthy of its own social history. So I have actually a relatively formal talk because this is a very new project. But one of the themes that emerged, and this came from being in Los Angeles and doing social research here, is that in researching war on drugs, I was shocked to find how much Black support there was for the war on drugs in the 1980s. And as a social movement historian, I have to say this makes me very unhappy. I am not happy about it at all. But I'm also committed to the empirics of trying to explain what happened. And so in a way, this paper is my attempt in my kind of initial research to try to theorize and understand the levels of support for the war on drugs in the 1980s, and then to chart how it changed over time. And then ultimately in the 1990s, we're going to see a little anger at the state for a variety of reasons. In the winter of 1985, the Los Angeles Police Department unveiled a signature new weapon in the drug war. With Police Chief Darrell Gates co-piloting, the Special Weapons and Tactics Team, SWAT, used a 14-foot-high battering ram attached to an armored vehicle to break into a house in Pacoima. After tearing a gaping hole in one of the outside walls, police found 2 women and 3 children eating ice cream. SWAT uncovered negligible quantities of illicit drugs, and the district attorney subsequently declined to prosecute. In the days that followed, the Black clergy and San Fernando Valley chapter of the NAACP organized a protest rally in a local church. "We don't need new weapons to be tried out on us," argued Reverend Joseph. "Of all the methods that there are to arrest a person, they used a brand new toy." Not all members of the African American community agreed, however. City Councilman David Cunningham, who represented South Los Angeles, praised Gates' actions, quote, "Go right ahead, Chief. You do whatever you can to get rid of these rock houses. They're going to destroy the Black community if you don't." These diversion responses embody the core contradiction produced by crack and the war on drugs for African American communities in the 80s. On the one hand, they faced an unprecedented scale in the militarization of policing, arrests, and incarceration. And on the other, many people, especially drawn from the ranks of the Black middle class, saw the crack economy and black-on-black crime itself as a comparable, if not greater, threat. To address the sense of urgency and its political consequences, activist scholar Clarence Lucene coined the term crack crisis to differentiate its meaning from the state-sponsored and moral panic-driven discourse of the crack epidemic. Lucene's formulation is a useful one, not only for writing about crack and the war on drugs' impact on communities of color in LA, but also for helping historians excavate the relationships between drug economies, state prohibition, and political efficacy. And crisis is a complex term, and I think that it can be mobilized for good and for reactionary agendas. But I do think in this case it's useful as an analytic term, as it helps to explain the levels of trauma that were experienced by African American communities in this era. In the same way that journalist Naomi Klein talks about disaster capitalism and its political utility for pushing through neoliberal restructuring, it's imperative to reckon with crack's significance for consolidating and rationalizing the war on drugs, even among communities that are the most hurt by policies driving mass incarceration. So this sense of crisis and trauma, I think, is very important to thinking about Black support for the war on drugs. One of the most striking elements of the regional war on drugs in Southern California was how deeply law and order campaigns permeated multiple sectors of civic and political life. From the head of the U.S. Olympic Committee for the 1984 Los Angeles Games to local PTAs in the racially segregated San Fernando Valley and community groups of color in South and East LA, multiple state and civil society actors declared their own wars on drugs. But these responses did not remain uniform or static. By the mid-1990s, many African Americans questioned the efficacy of hyper-militarized policing that resulted in the warehousing of youth of color. Los Angeles had the largest urban prison population in the U.S. and led the nation in punitive policy against drugs and gangs. The political history of the war on drugs is inextricably linked to the social history of drug economies. Scholarship on the consumption and distribution of illicit drugs has been largely confined to ethnography. However, illicit economies have their own histories that represent a crucial domain of state and private action. Indeed, in the case of the Reagan and Bush administrations, the crack epidemic and its mythic retinue of crack babies and crack mothers constituted a primary rationale for the war on drugs. Moreover, the perceived ravages of the crack crisis in the 1980s prompted many Angelenos of color to support more aggressive law enforcement despite decades of working towards greater police accountability. Heather Thompson has argued the history of mass incarceration remains largely unwritten, and this is nowhere more true in the history of the U.S. wars on drugs. Despite growing visibility in the form of mea culpas, public denunciations, and proclamations of failure, even by right-wing of the Republican Party, George Shultz, Friedman, so many people have repudiated the war on drugs. The history of America's drug wars is still largely unknown. This is surprising given their catalytic role in one of the largest state-building enterprises of the 20th century, mass incarceration. Scholars have argued that between 1985 and 2000, drug offenses composed 2/3 of the increase in federal inmates and half of the increase in state prison populations. At the federal, state, and local levels, this punitive turn in governance resulted in the criminalization of large sections of the U.S. population for illicit drug consumption, possession, and distribution. The extreme racial disparities of this war are well known. In spite of comparable drug use patterns to the general population, African Americans, who compose roughly 13% of the U.S., make up 37% of those arrested on drug charges and 56% of those incarcerated in state prison for drug convictions. Racial disparity at the federal level is the most stark and extreme, as Mark Maurer of the Sentencing Project has shown. Quote, despite the fact that 2/3 of regular crack users are white or Latino, 82% of defendants sentenced in federal court for crack offenses are African American. And that's really important because federal sentences are inevitably longer than state prison sentences, and that's one of the big structural aspects of the war on drugs, this federalization of drug crime with federally mandated mandatory minimums. Testifying on the one-year anniversary of the Bush administration's war on drugs, LAPD Police Chief Daryl Gates told the Senate Judiciary Committee, quote, the casual drug user ought to be taken out and shot. Although the chief's outrageous statements in the Rodney King beatings made the LAPD notorious in the early 90s, many of the department's aggressive tactics stem from a much earlier era of protest. So the development of SWAT is really a part of the counterinsurgency campaigns against Black and Brown power organizations. And SWAT is developed in '67 by a group of elite police who are all former military. They're all Vietnam vets, that matters. So some of this is the middle abuse of the military. But it's first deployed against the Southern California Black Panther Party, 41st and Central. So an important point about that is that some of these techniques of repression that are pioneered against political movements are later going to be utilized in the war on drugs. So that's another way that it's linked to this earlier period of political repression. Sure. Chief Daryl Gates' high-profile war on drugs reflected the larger policies and strategic aims of the national campaign, including saturation policing, asset forfeiture, federalization of drug charges, and mandatory minimum sentencing. Ultimately, this tendency culminated in Operation Hammer and the criminalization of gang membership itself. The war on drugs in LA might be more aptly summed up as a war on gangs, whereby the state criminalized participation in street organizations themselves. Between 1984 and 1988, California passed over 80 separate anti-gang measures and developed a powerful new legal tool, the anti-gang injunction. In December 1987, LA City Attorney and future Mayor James Hahn pioneered its use against the Playboy gangster Crips from West LA. So the first gang injunction is actually in Los Angeles. So that's important. The SWAT and the gang injunction, things that are really invented here and exported afterwards. Gang injunctions resemble restraining orders by prohibiting members from engaging in specified behaviors in a designated geographic area. They're different because they're permanent and they're open-ended. the prosecuting agency sued a gang as an unincorporated association, which made it possible for them to continually add people after their injunction was issued. Their civil nature also meant the state didn't have to provide legal representation. So that's really important, that this is this mass form of criminalization in which it's not mandated to provide a public defender. Gang injunctions work in tandem with municipal, state, and federal databases. In 1985, the LASD created its own computerized list, Gang Reporting Evaluation and Tracking System. The acronym, great. 7 years later, the Federal General Accounting Office revealed that the sheriffs listed 47% of all African American men in LA County between the ages of 21 and 24 as gang members. The combination of racially targeted policing with denial of legal representation made it virtually impossible for youth to have their names removed from these gang databases. Defining the war on drugs as a war on gangs justified the criminalization of everyday life in Black and brown Los Angeles. Modes of dress, color of shoelaces, gestures, and mere association became defined as prosecutable offenses. It's illegal to walk down the street with a young gang member, to wave at a car, or to appear in public with someone possessing alcohol. Saturation policing, anti-gang measures, and the criminalization of youth reinforced residential segregation and spatial apartheid in the decades after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Areas of the city in which normative racial barriers were breached or violent crime impacted non-Black or non-brown people became catalysts for police suppression. In Los Angeles, this tendency became manifest in the lead-up to the 1984 Olympics and the shooting of bystander Karen Toshima in Westwood in 1988. In preparation for the Games, a period of major institution building and militarization of law enforcement, Daryl Gates warned against gangs' terrorist potential. Particular anxiety focused on the proximity of South Los Angeles to the 3.5-mile perimeter of the UC campus, which housed one of the Olympic villages. After consulting with the Minister of Police in Sarajevo, the LAPD chief, quote, built a strong bug factor, end quote, into strategic planning and dispatched, quote, gang details to clean up the streets around the Coliseum. And this discourse really of disorder. One of the striking things when you read writings by Daryl Gates is that rarely does he name the people he's talking about. He really represents multiple sets as form of disorder or terrorism. Drawing on a repertoire of historical demonologies, the LAPD ultimately viewed gangs through the lens of terrorism or organized crime. Quote, it is probably a misnomer to call them street gangs, said Lieutenant Rushoff of the elite gang unit Crash. Quote, what we are seeing is the first indication of Black organized crime. Far from unique, the slippage from street gangs to drug trafficking, organized crime, and terrorism represented the defining ideology of the Reagan and Bush era war on drugs. Its solution was total suppression, removal of alleged gang members from the streets and mass incarceration. Quote, this is war. We want to get the message out to the cowards out there that they're going to come and get them, that we're going to come and get them. With this battle cry, the LAPD sent over 1,000 officers into South LA in conjunction with the task force Operation Hammer. On Saturday, April 9, 1988, the police arrested 1,400 people, including more African American youth in any single incident since the Watts rebellions. So we're getting that scale of Watts to roughly 6,000 people arrested. In Operation Hammer, over a 6-month period, there are 18,000 people that are arrested, and over half of those are listed in gang arrests. So that gives you a sense of this mass criminalization of Black youth under the war of gangs and drugs. As historians reckon with the temporal shifts in youth culture, street organizations, and gangs over the 20th century, it's imperative to separate the history of gangs from the illicit economy and to capture the historical contingencies of both. And I really want to stress this. Most gangs do not engage in drug dealing. Most street gangs. That's one of the greatest misconceptions, and it's something where I think law enforcement, the state, and popular culture meet and conflating street gangs with drug dealing and the economy. And that's one of the biggest arguments of this paper, is that we need to uncouple them, because this idea of conflating the two was core to the process of criminalization. As municipal, state, and federal law enforcement deployed enormous resources to eradicate youth gangs, criminologists directly challenged the assumptions that underlay this policy. Drawing on statistical analysis of the arrest logs of the LAPD and the LASD, Malcolm Klein argued that only 25% of cocaine sales from 1983 to 1985 entailed street gang-related participation. Moreover, as the total number of drug arrests increased dramatically in this 2-year period of crack's takeoff, the percentage of gang involvement dropped. So, and Malcolm Klein does this research again in 1988, 1989, and finds similar low-level involvement of street gangs in drug distribution. So I think that's really important that we have this empirical example coming from law enforcement's own arrest laws that contradicts these mass criminalization of the war gangs. The paradox, and now I'm going to really talk about the transnational political economy that's essential, I think, to understanding crack's takeoff. And it's not teenagers in South Los Angeles or other parts of the city. It really is part of Cold War inter-communist networks that are central to cocaine trafficking in the 80s and 90s. The paradox of the crack crisis is that despite the enormous resources mobilized to stop it, the drug's availability steadily increased as it saturated illicit markets in Los Angeles and other cities. So steadily throughout this mass criminalization, we're seeing the supply increase and the price drop. Law enforcement's obsession with street gangs, which centered largely on the behavior of teenage youth in South and East LA, provided few real answers to its takeoff. Examined from hindsight, crack's emergence was inseparable from Ronald Reagan's Cold War insurgency campaigns in Latin America and the transnational illicit drug economies these policies engendered. In the fall of 1979, the LA Times announced that, quote, a cocaine snowstorm hit Los Angeles, the same year of the Sandinista Revolution. Sweeping north from Peru and Colombia, this onslaught of Andean cocaine initiated a sharp drop in price per kilo, and as a result, prompted underground distributors to develop new methods for expanding the market from the drug's traditional wealthy elite to poor and working class people. A re-engineered mixture of cocaine, baking soda, and other additives resulted in a product called rock and later crack. In contrast to powdered cocaine, this new substance was smoked and inhaled directly into the lungs, creating an infinitely more powerful high, but also ephemeral and highly addictive. Even more important than the drug's pharmacological effects to its social transformation was its cost. Initially dropping to $25 in the early 80s, which at that time was considered revolutionary for cocaine, as the river of illegal Andean cocaine flowed throughout Reagan's first term, the price of an individual unit of rock cocaine dropped to $5 per hit. By 1985, the LA Times declared Southern California as the world's largest retail market for cocaine. According to California law enforcement, large-scale drug interdiction efforts in South Florida in the early 80s shifted transnational distribution circuits to the West Coast. And this is a pattern that happens often both with international drug interdiction and within neighborhoods. That when it stopped in one area, it finds a new path and a different route. Excavating the multiple drug wars of the late 20th century requires considering the competing aims of different state agencies in the transnational political economy of the Cold War. Revelations by journalists Brian Barger, Robert Perry, and Gary Webb have shown that Los Angeles' crack crisis was integrally linked to U.S. counterinsurgency efforts in Latin America. Anti-communist drug trafficking networks forged through the Contra War in Nicaragua and the Bolivian cocaine coup in 1980 helped supply illicit drugs to LA and other regional markets in the U.S. Despite its massive expenditures on the domestic war on drugs, the Reagan administration's support for Central American counterinsurgency was a driving force behind the crack explosions in the U.S. The interdisciplinary scholarship on informal economy offers the best toolkit for tracing links between these intricate webs of illicit activity and a range of state actors. And I just want to say something quick about Gary Webb. It's hard to describe the scale of the immediate onslaught of Gary Webb. For those of us who remember it, you remember what it was like. There's a new book published about him called Kill the Messenger by journalist Nick Shue. And he describes this as one of the worst campaigns, arguably maybe the worst campaign against a journalist in the 20th century. So incredible resources were mobilized against Gary Webb. And he committed suicide in 2004 after essentially having his life destroyed, being forcibly demoted, and really blacklisted. I think that's one way to describe it by mainstream media. But history has actually been very kind to Gary Webb. The LA Times published an article by Nick Shue largely affirming Gary Webb's findings and arguing that in some cases this was an even larger economy than even Gary Webb described. And I think that we're entering a time where historians are beginning to go back to look at it in contra. And I think it's a very exciting and important project, and really a truly transnational project for historians in different regions to write about how these anti-communist networks involved illicit drug trafficking that link all different parts of the world affected domestic drug supplies. There's also a film coming out about Gary Webb this year, starring Jeremy Renner from the Hurt Locker. So I think that in a way, this is being admitted now into public discourse and mainstream discourse where it can be talked about and discussed. While the geopolitical dimensions remained largely obscure until the late 1990s, taken together, the war on drugs and crack had devastating effects on Black communities across the country. In 1986, the sudden death of Maryland basketball star Lynn Bias prompted national leaders to declare a state of emergency. In a news conference on Capitol Hill, Jesse Jackson argued, quote, "We must see drug abuse as a threat to our culture, greater than any ideology ever could be. We must rally the government to this issue." In Los Angeles, the epicenter of the crack crisis by the mid-1980s, divergent responses reflected fault lines of class, geography, ideology, and faith. Historically, the city had the largest interracial wealth gap, so within the Black community, and this disparity influenced how different sectors of Black LA understood the war on drugs. Throughout the early 80s, when the crack crisis was in its infancy, middle-class reformist organizations sponsored popular marches calling attention to the plight of neighborhoods in South Central and East LA. In July 1985, shortly after an injunction had been brought against the use of the LAPD's battering ram, nearly 10,000 residents gathered on the downtown campus at St. Mary's College for an anti-crime rally. The Southern California Organizing Committee, SCOC, and the East Los Angeles United Neighborhoods Organization, UNO, co-sponsored the protest, which demanded that a share of the Olympic surplus monies fund youth programs in South Central and East LA. SCOC and UNO's demand revealed a mixture of law and order politics with maternalist advocacy for social welfare and youth programs. Given historical fights over adequate policing and higher rates of violent crime in South LA, African Americans were 6 times more likely in this period to be killed by homicide than whites. Their concerns were not surprising. Nevertheless, hallmarks of militarized law enforcement were unmistakable in their punitive vision of reform. SCOC and UNO advocated establishing combat zone teams drawn from multiple law enforcement agencies to target gangs and drug traffickers in high crime areas, higher taxes on liquor to pay for more police, increases in federal drug agents in LA, and perhaps most importantly, building a black and brown coalition to force local officials to provide more police protection. Quote, "We come here to make a choice today," argued Father Luis Olivares of La Placita Church. "We can't fight those who stuff drugs into our children, or we can fight those who stuff drugs into our children, or we can just sit on our butts and wish it weren't so." SCOC was not alone in its support for more punitive drug policy. A Black mayor and former police captain presided over Los Angeles' war on drugs and gangs. The contradictions of the Bradley administration have a great deal to tell us, not only about the racial politics of law and order, but the fate of Black-led municipalities in the decades after the Black Power movement. Mayor Bradley fought to increase the size of law enforcement while at the same time working towards police reform. Despite the historic enmity between Mayor Bradley and LAPD Chief Daryl Gates, they both denounced gang members as urban terrorists and embraced the de facto policies driving mass incarceration at the local level. As historians document the resistance to the carceral state and the war on drugs, it's exploring how state retrenchment and neoliberal restructuring influenced African American and Latino modes of protest is crucial background. In contrast to the era of the Great Society and the long Black freedom movement, by the early 1990s, not-for-profits competed with grassroots social movement groups as legitimate medium for organized dissent. With the exception of the Coalition Against Police Abuse, many Los Angeles progressives directed their energies not at challenging the war on drugs violations, civil liberties, militarization of policing, or expansion of prison populations, but focused instead on confronting the drug crisis by other means. And I just wanted to make a quick point about this, is that I think it's worth, for people writing about kind of domestic social movement politics, to look at some of the literature in NGOs. But I think the not-for-profits within the large cities in many ways are functioning like NGOs are. And I think that they have an important role in constraining dissent. And I think this is a big shift. You know, as a post-war social movement historian, I'm always drawn to groups that talk about community. But this kind of neoliberal vision of community, I think, is something that emerges in the 80s and 90s. And it's also another piece of talking about why we're not seeing grassroots mobilization against the war on drugs. In 1990, Karen Bass founded the Community Coalition for Substance Abuse Prevention and Treatment. Having worked as a physician's assistant at the Los Angeles County USC Hospital Emergency Room, Bass witnessed the devastating effects of addiction firsthand. Quote, "I just really became obsessed with how the drug problem, specifically the crack epidemic, was impacting the community," she later explained. From its inception, the Community Coalition saw itself as working inside the parameters of the community partnerships model of the Bush era Department of Health and Human Services. Rather than a grassroots social movement organization, Community Coalition was a not-for-profit that initially sought funding from the Office of Substance Abuse and private foundations. So I think following the money in these organizations is very important. The coalition advocated mandatory school counseling, drug and gang diversion programs, and utilizing asset forfeiture to finance drug treatment. And I have to say, of everything I found in this research, this surprised me the most, of the number of progressive groups that were hoping to use asset forfeiture to fund their programs. And I think that, better than anything, expresses this almost hegemonic idea of the war on drugs. Quote, "Our mission essentially is to address the drug and alcohol problems of the community," Bass explained. Quote, "We don't do that by providing direct services such as treatment or counseling, but we do that by organizing and empowering community residents to change the environment that creates drug and alcohol problems in the first place." In contrast to the state-sponsored war on drugs, Community Coalition redirected the public's focus from illicit drugs like heroin and crack to the illicit commodities of alcohol and tobacco that they described as saturating South LA. The coalition's most sustained activism centered on preventing liquor stores from reopening after the 1992 Los Angeles rebellion. Modeling their efforts on homeowner associations, the coalition organized residents to clean up the streets. By eliminating the environment that fostered crime and addiction, including liquor stores, transient hotels, open-air sex and drug markets, the coalition sought to transform, and this is their words, the hopelessness and despair of South LA. While the Community Coalition had elements of a modern temperance movement, it also reflected the shifting political terrain of the 80s and 90s. And I just wanted to highlight this focus on behavior, really understanding the origins of drug economies as we did in behavior and vice, versus looking at the larger structural problems of essential jobs, the fight for jobs and social welfare services. So I think in many ways this is understandable. There's no money available for the federal government in this period, so people are trying to work in areas that they can. But nevertheless, I think this is a huge concession for the ideology of building windows policing and the war on drugs. The most enduring voice against police violence in LA was former Black Panther Michael Zinzum and the Coalition Against Police Abuse, CAPA. Founded in 1976, CAPA reflected both internal and external influences within the Panthers. By the late 70s, the organization was in steep decline and had been suffering from years of state repression. CAPA was interesting, though, because it didn't really have an external analysis of the Panthers' decline. It also was concerned about the democratic central structure of the Oakland leadership. So they were interested in creating this egalitarian, decentralized modes of organizing. And their motto was, "We will work with you, not for you," which I think speaks to this different vision. Starting out with a handful of participants in the late 70s, CAPA compiled documentation of police abuse and murders in Los Angeles using statistics, photographs, media clippings, and interviews. So the documentation part of CAPA is very important for creating a record of police violence. During the height of the drug war, a small circle of activists taught community members how to document police abuses, utilize media, wage legal campaigns, and really confront this emerging carceral state. While the coalition created an intergenerational channel for organizing, it never succeeded at building a mass base in South Central Los Angeles. And I thought that's something we want to talk about in the question and answer period, why the radical organizations aren't able to get more of a mass base. However, in the early 90s, CAPA gained greater visibility in the aftermath of the Rodney King beatings and the LA rebellions. A bridge between an older generation of black collar radicals and younger Angelenos, CAPA's most important role was as a clearinghouse for new activist formations. The coalition worked so closely with the organizers of the gang truce that they shared offices. By orchestrating an agreement modeled on the 1949 peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, this grassroots movement by gang members challenged the reigning ideology of the war on drugs and gangs. The Multi-Peace Treaty, General Armistice Agreement, showed that the warehousing of youth was not nearly as effective at reducing violence as sustained intergenerational and peer organizing. Strikingly, the gang truce explicitly harkened back to an earlier era of African American protest. Quote, "Instead of shooting each other," explained a member of the Crips, "we decided to fight together for Black power." In 1996, CAPA worked together with an even more powerful challenge to the war on drugs, the Crack the CIA Coalition. Following the publication of the Dark Alliance series by Gary Webb, San Jose Mercury News journalist Gary Webb, radical activists in LA seized the opportunity to mobilize people against U.S. covert action abroad and the drug war at home. Webb alleged a direct link between the CIA-supported Nicaraguan Contra forces and Los Angeles' transformation into, quote, the crack capital of the world. With the complicity of the U.S. government, Contra supporters, Oscar Danilo Blandon and Noel Menendez, sold between 2,000 and 4,000 kilos of cocaine in LA throughout the 1980s and used the proceeds to fund the Fuerza Democrática Nicaragua, the FDN. Webb stressed that while a whole generation of Black and brown youth languished in prison for minor drug charges, both Blandon and Menendez, who worked as CIA informants, escaped without serving significant jail time. The tragedy and perceived hypocrisy of the war on drugs became a boon to anti-carceral organizing in LA in the 90s. In October 1996, a rally was held with 2,500 people, and when CIA Director John Deutsch came to Watts, to Locke High School, to address Webb's allegation, he faced an angry, overflow crowd. You can see actually some of the footage of this on YouTube. It's absolutely amazing. There are thousands of people all screaming at the head of the CIA. So after John Deutsch traveled to Watts to address Webb's allegation, he faced an angry, overflow crowd. Even the Los Angeles Times, this is interesting because I even remember this from the time, which pilloried Gary Webb, so they're one of the main agents that attacked Webb, published a story by Peter Kornblum encouraging Deutsch to appease South LA by, quote, acknowledging that the CIA did in fact knowingly and willingly work with drug dealers. When the U.S. Civil Rights Commission subpoenaed Michael Zinzin in 1996 for a hearing on police abuse in Los Angeles, he insisted on testifying about new evidence of the CIA complicity in local crack distribution. The CAPA founder was not alone. A broad spectrum of activists worked with the Crack the CIA Coalition, including Sandinista solidarity groups, seasoned Black Communist Party organizers, the West Coast branch of Stokely's All African People's Revolutionary Party, and the NAACP. And this was one of the things that I found. There are not many happy parts of this story, but I think the Crack the CIA to me was probably the thing that I was most excited about. And it allows us to think about how many of the activists of the Black Power movement, Black radicals, continue to be active after their organizations were disbanded. So in that sense, you really have people that have suffered multiple types of state repression. You have old members of the Communist Party from LA, Sandinista solidarity networks. In some cases, we have Nicaraguans. Sandinistas were involved in this. So it really is kind of a wonderful example of this multiracial left coalition. And so in a way to think about Black Power activism beyond after the organizations themselves have been dismantled. And so I think of it as a little bit, we talked about the long Black freedom movement extending, looking at the history of activists like Ella Baker extending back into the 30s and forward to the 1960s. But I think we're also seeing that with the radical activists in the late 60s extending forward into the late 1990s. So I was very happy to see this. At the same time, I think this is a history that's still really a local history. Because of the lack of access to media, this is a story that I physically had to come to LA to find. So more to be said about that. Over the next 2 years, the Crack the CIA Coalition worked tirelessly to publicize state complicity in the crack crisis. Ultimately, Congresswoman Maxine Waters demanded hearings before Congress and the release of both parts of the CIA Inspector's General Report. Although most of the mainstream media dismissed the Crack the CIA and the Congressional Black Caucus efforts as a wave of irrational Black paranoia and conspiracy theory, Webb's revelations and the organizing that it inspired played a critical role in shifting Black political discourse on the war on drugs in LA. By co-sponsoring marches, rallies, media events, and even lawsuits, the Crack the CIA Coalition mobilized anti-drug war protests in Southern California and Black communities across the country. So to conclude, I think that the racist intent and effects of the war on drugs is very clear. I think that's been well documented. Through disparate or vast prosecution and sentencing, it resulted in the criminalization, really, of a whole generation of poor and working class Black and brown youth. What is more painful, and perhaps harder to explain in hindsight, given this reality, is how the war on drugs engendered such surprising levels of support in Black LA for punitive policies that fueled mass incarceration in the 1980s. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, this is really not something that I expected to find. And it's just, I've seen it in all of the sources, and it's forced me to try to reckon with it, to understand it, and to put it in its own context. It's one of the reasons that I use that language talking about the multiple wars on drugs being waged by different state and civil society actors, because I think there's a way in which the war on drugs became a hegemonic ideology, and people are developing their own visions of the war on drugs, and it's really a barrier, I think, to effective organizing and politicization against these carceral policies until the 1990s. Providing a fully loaded cost accounting of the crack crisis and war on drugs in Black Los Angeles requires examining its effects in multiple arenas, including not only the criminal justice apparatus of the carceral state, law enforcement, judicial system, jails and prisons, but also in schools, neighborhood associations, civil rights groups, electoral officials, not-for-profit organizations, and radical activists. One of the great tragedies of the war on drugs is that by the mid-1980s, communities of color saw themselves as so ravaged by the crack crisis that many residents accepted and in select instances advocated drastic rollbacks of Fourth Amendment rights, militarization of policing, and the warehousing of youth. At the same time, these developments are historically contingent. Disenchantment with mass incarceration and the outrage following Gary Webb's revelations led many to rethink their embrace of punishment and to return to a discourse of state accountability. The history of CAPA and the Crack the CIA Coalition in late 20th century LA point to a new research agenda for historians seeking to document not only the history of the war on drugs, but also of resistance to it. Los Angeles embodied many of the drug war's worst aspects, and in spite of this history, or perhaps because of it, the city produced some of its most compelling opposition. Thank you.
Donna, thank you so much. That was wonderful. It was informative, it was fascinating, and we appreciate your sharing your research with us. Do we have any questions?
I'm working on a chapter of my dissertation on the '84 Olympics, and I found really similar things about the militarization of policing, but then also I was surprised to find the grassroots groups, UNO and SCOC. I was looking for complaints about police abuse and all of that, and the deportations and gang sweeps and stuff like that. And what I found was the rallies for saying, you're giving us this attention during the Olympics of this period of tourism, why can't we have this kind of police attention all the time? And so I wondered if I was curious about if you think that's like an effect of those groups being, like they're church-based, they're connected to the IAF, if those are kind of groups that just got more media attention, or if it really was that they were the more prevalent, more strongly organized groups. Because if you look at like things like the Sentinel, they're getting all the press, but I wonder, are there like community newspapers or anything like that?
Yeah. It's interesting with the Sentinel, because the Sentinel is not sympathetic at all to Gary Webb and the Crack the CIA Coalition. I was also very disappointed to see that.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the piece I was talking about with the class politics of Black LA, because the Sentinel just does not come out at all. And I think the Sun Reporter, that's run by Carlton Goodman in San Francisco, Emory Douglas, is literally working for them, the Panther artist, until about 2004. It's much better. It's a multi-millionaire, but he's a progressive millionaire that ties to the Communist Party. Sentinel is not like that. I think this is actually the central question, research question, methodological question, because this debate is going on not only, I think in some ways, talking about Black support for the war on crime is more definitive in the 1980s than it is in the 1970s. there's a debate going on among social scientists, Michael Fortner and Vesla Weaver, about Black complicity in the development of the first war on drugs. And I think Michael Fortner, to make a parallel example, identifies Reverend Dempsey, who's head of a big church. He goes on tours with Nelson Rockefeller, gets a lot of media attention, he also has an archive as a result. I think that in Fortner, it's very clear that he takes essentially a middle-class figure who's aligned himself with someone incredibly powerful, and therefore has archives, is appearing in the New York Times, and treats that as representative of Black political opinion, which I think is insufficient research, put it like that. On the other hand, I think it's difficult, and this is one of my own challenges, it's one of the reasons I'm in Los Angeles, to try to get a sense of people who lived in the neighborhoods and how they felt about the war on drugs. So I feel most comfortable in talking about SCOC and Bruno as middle-class reformist organizations. I think the question of who owns property and who doesn't is important to this question, and doing more precise analysis about the locations and getting a sense of the social basis of these organizations also through oral history is important. But I've really just been doing social research in LA for 4 months, so I'm sort of beginning with my book. But I think this is a question that requires deep research. My sense, from spending time at the Southern California Library and talking to people, is that there was a lot of support in the neighborhood for the wars on drugs. But that's really anecdotal and impressionistic. But I think that's all right, because we start with impressions. When you do social research, you start with impressions. That's how I ended up researching the migrant history of the Black Panther Party. I talked to people, and I was like, everyone's really Southern here. Everyone's so Southern. And I thought, oh, what does that mean? And figure out how to research it systematically. And I think that kind of social research is needed also. You have any other questions?
Yeah, and you talked about how important it is to speak to the people who live in the communities while it was going on. I was curious, has the evacuation, like African Americans from some of these traditional African American neighborhoods, has that made it difficult to know yourself? I mean, was it living in Compton back in the day, come back to visit Compton? Not many Black people there compared to which were there in the 1980s. And has that at all affected your research? And it's my impression that that's the case in all of South Central Los Angeles.
Yeah, it's a difficult point. I mean, I think that this kind of research is very messy research. It's not research that's defined by the parameters of an archive. But at the same time, I think the questions themselves are urgent enough that we get as close as we can. But the problem of urban displacement, also because the people I interviewed before I ended up focusing on Los Angeles, I was working in the national history of crack, and I researched a lot. And I actually right now start crack better in Oakland than I do in Los Angeles. But one of the big points that an interview subject made to me about crack in Oakland and Berkeley, is that the kind of economic crisis that was engendered by the crack economy and by all the different things that went along with that led to displacement and loss of property. This had an economic significance. So I think the overlapping processes of what's going on in the 1980s of rising rents, displacement, the different types of crisis, I think are all made this kind of research difficult.
It was just so fantastic. It's taken me a little while to sort of get my head around everything. I wanted to go back to the beginning when you talked about the gang injunctions, which was so fascinating to me. I did not know the part about being incorporated as an organization, therefore you can't have the council representation, therefore you're restricted from defense within the criminal justice system. I would like to hear you talk a little bit more about how you theorize the gang injunctions. To me, it sounds like when people can't stand on the street corner with their friends, when they can't wear certain clothing, when they can't move in certain ways, that extinguishes life. It's genocidal. So I would like to hear how you feel about it.
I don't know, got shocked to read about gang injunctions, if it was possible. And one of the things that really heartbreaking is that I've gotten very good at reading law review articles. I just wondered, how do lawyers get tenure on law review articles? I realized they're 100 pages long.
With about a page worth of argument, though.
That's true. Most of it. 2/4 of this, 3/4 of it is footnotes, but that's good for us, right? We're good with that. But one of the things that the lawyer said who worked as a criminal defense attorney is that the gang injunction would never work if they could afford private representation. This is something that would be immediately deemed illegal. And that is a place where you see the very brutal class violence of the war on drugs. All of this is impossible because people don't have access to legal representation. And so I agree with you. I talk about in terms of criminalization, containment, the mass reach of these databases, that 47% of young men from 21 to 24, African-American men in LA County are included in the RATE database. So that interaction between the civil gang injunction and the databases, it's interesting because people talk about incarceration as a form of social mobilization. And I think what you're describing is social mobilization on the street, that ordinary acts become prosecutable offenses. And I think one of the other issues about the war on drugs is how each of us, depending on our own class and racial subject position, are experiencing the state radically differently. These are gang injunction. In fact, I didn't even know what a gang injunction was until I started doing this research. And the depth of the kind of apparatus, the legal apparatus, the physical apparatus, the cost of it all. One historian and talking about incarceration talks about the myth of the weak state. So for those of us that are looking at these later periods and talking about neoliberal retrenchment, the reach and overreach and overcriminalization that's going on in war on drugs, I think, is remarkable. And it's something that requires much greater research. There's not much written by historians, but there's a lot written by lawyers who are working kind of on the front lines of this. And so that's been a real resource for me. I didn't talk about the ACLU, but the ACLU in Southern California really becomes a very radical organization. They're the ones who file an injunction, a good injunction, to stop the LA battering ram, the use of the LAPD battering ram. So just the protection of very basic constitutional rights in Los Angeles with this incredible apparatus that's being created is really, I think, radical activism.
Yeah, but I apologize for missing the beginning. I was teaching my class, talking about Frederick Douglass, and I was running over here. So everything, of course, I know more about the work from our conversations and just wonderful presentation. I think that you actually, it was an epiphany for me. I realized that part of what you're talking about is criminalization, not simply as class reproduction. We think of criminalization as a way to reproduce a subject class. It's actually class exclusion. And by thinking about criminalization as class exclusion, it does two things. One, it certainly allows the police to do exactly what you're talking about. Criminal justice to sort of exclude them from basic civil liberties, right, without any question because they're terrorists. But the other thing it does is it creates the conditions for black support for the war on drugs because they're excluded from the class. So in other words, if we keep thinking of it as like the middle class versus the poor, we miss the fact that the investment in the war on drugs is an investment in the control of a people who are no longer in the class. They're subjected to some kind of netherworld of the terrorists, of the violent non-persons. So I think this idea of class exclusion is one of the really brilliant points of your work that we really have to come to terms with. What does that mean? Because we end up falling into this trap of trying to find the middle class origins of opposition to the kinds of behaviors, as if this is not a working class movement as well. So I just wanted your thoughts about that.
Yeah, thank you. That's very, very helpful, I think, for realizing it that way. What immediately came to mind is reading the gang memoirs, which I have to say are one of my least favorite genres. I have to read them. I find them excruciating to read. There's some things we can talk about. But, like Sanika Shakur continually talks about himself as shoe class. So he's talking about Pelican Bay and the isolation in the hole, and this group of prisoners who was involved in the recent organizing that's been going on in Pelican Bay. He just got out of jail, out of Basin Spring Prison, accurately, just a couple months ago. So he cycles in and out of prison and out of Pelican Bay. The shoe is essentially the hole is continuing student units. And I was so struck by that language of talking about themselves as the shoe class. So they appropriate a language and they see themselves as a class. So you can certainly see it in prison organizing. Yeah, I think it's very, in a way, it's a story that's very crass and brutal. If you can afford a lawyer, you can get out of the gang injunction if you can. So in that way, it's overlapping the kinds of people that appear in databases because of the nature of gang sweeps and the types of arrest politics tend to be Black and Latino. But beyond that, money, literally money is so important to being able to escape this criminalization. I mean, the war on drugs, I'll be honest, for me, it's not something that many of its policies are not easy to understand intuitively. And I'll give you an example. What's so painful is that if you look at what's happening in the war on drugs, they are criminalizing and using incredible amounts of resources to punish the most vulnerable sectors of the population. People that are vulnerable in terms of economics, people that are vulnerable in terms of race, people that are vulnerable also psychologically, because overwhelming number of people that are in prison are not people involved in drug selling, but in drug possession, are drug users. And in that way, I guess at an intuitive level, it's hard to understand the amount of resources and the anger that's directed at drug users in this period. And in thinking about it, a friend of mine said this, and Noam Chomsky reaffirmed it in one of his talks, that in looking at these kinds of campaigns, it's very important to think about what purpose they were serving. And I really think that the war on drugs is not, this is where you differentiate the multiple wars on drugs. You have how the war on drugs is understood and defined by these, by African American community groups, and a variety of the ones that I talked about. Then you have the executive, the important role that we play for the presidency and for governors. So you have these multiple levels of the wars on drugs. But I think ultimately, there's a new history that just came out by Kathleen Friedel, the history of the first war on drugs from 1940 to 1973. And she argues that this is a major shift, a macro shift in American politics, where you're shifting from taxation as the primary form of regulation of the New Deal state to a state that is really punishing its way to power, to a state of punishment. And I find that very compelling. I mean, it's a kind of radical interpretation of state-centered theory, but I do think that these big macro developments are very important. So there's more to be done. Really, this history has not been written at any of the levels that I just talked about. There is no history. There's no history written right now of the war on drugs in the 1980s. Only one book on the first war on drugs.
Should we take one last question?
Tendency to be like bringing up the rear. I want to say thank you so much for a really wonderful talk, and in a way this is kind of a follow-up question to what Robin was asking. And I think this is such a fascinating, compelling question that you're asking, one of a series of questions about what is the nature of Black investment in this punitive aspect of the war on drugs. And part of what I'm wondering is that I'm just listening to you as you're talking, and I'm wondering a couple of things. Does this have something to do with a very particular post-civil rights movement? A lot of people critique that term, but just to situate it chronologically, with just a certain kind of a social and psychological proclivity or discourse towards just feeling like we are entitled to the protection of the state, and just in other words, do you think that this may reflect a very particular social and political moment where Black communities are, at least ostensibly on paper, able to kind of claim certain rights of citizenship, certain kind of access to resources, and in a very larger sense as like kind of being part of the nation state? Another thing that I was wondering was if how you touched on this earlier, but just the extent to which this really profound liberal that's become a neoliberal discourse about individualistic, behavior and a Republican-based ideology that we're more familiar with in terms of kind of individuated responsibility. And I'm thinking of the popular icons of the moment, the Cosbys and so forth. I'm just wondering how much that's seeping into the communities and kind of rearranging the ways that people are thinking about, moving up or quote unquote bettering themselves.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that, yes, it's interesting because we're kind of thinking about class formation in all these different ways. And I do think it's important because this is a period that we really, or at least I'm still figuring out what's happening. It's contemporary history, it's happening in my lifetime, it's something that I think the first draft of history is just emerging. I do think it reflects a particular moment. In the original draft, this is probably one more article. In the original draft, I had a little section on Bill Cosby. Not only the Cosby Show, but his statements about crack and his statements about drug users and this differentiation of fear of being confused with these people, this excluded class, if you will. And what comes to mind, this was my own personal moment of horror that I remember from the 80s or early 90s is when Henry Louis Gates went on Frontline and they interviewed him and he essentially was saying, yes, I'm Black, I'm African American, and they had a so-called drug dealer who was shown in shadow, and he basically was like, and look at this person and I think, how does he have anything to do with me? How could he ever be considered as part of the same race? And at that moment on the front line, I thought of Alice as a defining moment of this real definition against. I think that piece of class is also so important. That class is not only defining with, but it's defining against. In this very brutal class differentiation in the 1980s and how mass incarceration, the carceral state affects this. Because almost what we're seeing in the civil rights era is that there are a group of people that are given access to the state. We have a warrant that's being prosecuted by a Black mayor, and this happens all over the country. The 1970s is the high tide of the Black electoral movement. And it's really, when you talk to people I interviewed in my first book, the African American Association, the 70s for them is such a hopeful time, for Black elites. They have gained access and they're getting jobs and there's a whole kind of infrastructure around the new Black mayors that are being elected. Certainly there was in Oakland and there's in Los Angeles. Thomas Bradley is elected with 13-14% of the population being African American in Los Angeles. So I think for Black elites in the 70s, in terms of their access to the state, is really a time of triumph.